Hello students, welcome to the Analyst dated 17th of October 2023. Today we'll look at 5 important articles from the Indian Express and the Hindu. The first article will be regarding the electoral bonds. Then we'll take a look at the Delhi excise policy. Then we'll take up the Himalayan EIA. And finally, we'll look at what is a constitutional bench. And lastly, what is the Arab League. Let's start with the first article, that is electoral bond. Now, why this is in news is because the electoral bond scheme, it has gone to the Supreme Court, which has referred it to the constitutional bench. And this is an issue which is directly linked to political funding. Now, if we have a clean political funding, what happens? Then we have a better representatives, and which leads to stronger democratic institutions. And in our previous sessions, what have we seen? That political funding is marred with money laundering, corruption, and criminalization of politics, which individually we have dealt, and therefore this issue becomes extremely important. Now, ADR, which usually comes out with a report on criminalization of politics, is extremely skeptical of the electoral bond scheme, and it has come out with some data. It has come out with some data in its ADR report on electoral bond, where it is saying that since 2016-17, when it was rolled out, to 2022, more than 55% of any political funding has been through the electoral bond route, which makes it extremely anonymous of who is donating what sum of money to which political party, and which is a violation of the right to know. Basically, the right to information, which is part of Article 19(1)(a). Now, given that I should know about the whereabouts of my candidate, what kind of funding my candidate is taking, what is the source of the funding, and what are the clear-cut beneficiaries of this particular political funding. But if all of my funds, they become anonymous, then what happens? I am violated of my right to know. Then the corporate donations, it only increased by 48% during this same time, but the electoral bond route, it increased by 743%. This is not a mere coincidence, and therefore there are chances that in the name of anonymity, again money laundering, black money, or corruption is being shielded, and that is the allegation that the ADR report is pointing out. Furthermore, the report points out that state-based parties are receiving as high as 93% of their total political contributions from electoral bonds, and national parties are getting it as high as 61% and 52%. And therefore, it is the right of the voters to know that who are the beneficiaries and who is giving this money. Now, what are electoral bonds? So essentially, it came through the Finance Bill of 2017 and was implemented in 2018. The idea is that there will be a bank, SBI. SBI will issue some bonds, and in return, there will be some money donated by any individual or a group of individual or a company. Now, what they do is that they will get a bond in their hand, and this bond then they can give to any political party. So the moment this bond is given to this political party, the political party can only exchange this bond for their money, and the money that they will get in there, it will come to their accounts. So the idea is simple, that I am maintaining my anonymity. How? Because I am giving, let's say, 10,000 rupees, and in return I am getting a bond. from SBI. Now, once I get the bond, so I have the bond in my hand and I give it to, let's say, a political party. Now, the political party will exchange this bond for money. There is no name, there is no identity in the bond itself. And therefore, the political party exchanges it for money, but the voters do not know who has given, who has donated how much money to whom. Now, SBI will issue these bonds in the denomination of 1,000, 10,000, 1 lakh, 10 lakh, 1 crore. And there has been an exponential rise in terms of the total proportion of political contribution coming from electoral bonds. And if we look at individual parties also, they are also increasing. And simultaneously, there is also a skew. A skew, that is, there is more preference of donation through the electoral bond route to established party. Parties which have, let's say, a regional presence, a statewide presence, or national presence. And amongst all the parties, the national parties, they have taken the largest amount of contributions when you compare with all other parties. Now, who can donate? So the person must be an Indian entity or an Indian citizen, and it is only valid for 15 calendar days. That means the moment I get the bond after paying the sum of amount, I have to give it to the political party within 15 days without registering my name, and only registered political parties will be able to get this benefit of electoral bond scheme. That means if you are not registered, you are not getting this large amount of sum, which has seen more than 700% of growth in last 5 years. And it can be purchased digitally or through checks. Now, what was the benefit that used to accrue? So the idea is that all the political parties will then have to disclose that how much money they got and from whom to ECI. And the donations are always made through banking channels. That means the use of cash was to be decreased. So that was the idea, that while I am ensuring anonymity of the donor, why? Because the donor can be harmed. Let's say the donor gives a huge amount of contribution to a political party, but in the other state, it is not giving any donation. If the name of the donor comes out, then it can very well happen that the business interest of this donor can be harmed in some other state or in any state where there is the opposition party. So that was the fear, and that is why anonymity was given. And simultaneously, we have to decrease the use of cash in elections. And so going through banking channels and disclosing it to Election Commission of India. However, what are the challenges is that we are not able to know who is donating what, quantum, and who is the donor, and whether or not the donor is having some special interest. Let's say there is some kickbacks allocated, kickback in the form of, let's say I give the donation today and later point of time I will get some tenders. So this kind of kickbacks, or can I say crony capitalism, can be promoted. And what if this is nothing but a scheme which is being used or misused by some political parties for, let's say, money laundering or embezzlement, by using, let's say, dirty money or money which is coming from ill-gotten wealth, which is coming from some criminal sources. It is again being, let's say, this is the source of crime, and then through the electoral bond route, it is again coming back to the political parties, which are again using the route of criminalization of politics and politicization of criminals. They are building a nexus in accordance with Vora committee. So this is a slippery slope, and there must be some form of transparency that we can acquire. Now, all these complex issues will inter alia be discussed by the Supreme Court, and that is why its constitutionality has been challenged and it will be heard by the 5-judge bench. Let's look at the second article, which is the Delhi Excise Policy. Now, the Enforcement Directorate is contemplating to go against a political party and keep it as accused in the excise policy case. Now, let's understand what is the excise policy case. So, there was an old excise policy and there was a new excise policy that has come in 2021. In the old excise policy, the government and the private party, they used to handle the liquor vends. But in the new regime, what happened? There was some competition from regional states, from regional players like Haryana. So Haryana has a very successful excise policy and a lot of people would go towards the borders of Delhi, towards Gurgaon, towards Haryana to buy liquor. So a competitive policy was bought in 2021 where the private sector were given these vends not on the basis of individual vends but on the basis of zones. So Delhi was divided into 32 zones and each of these zones were gone to retail players, to private players, and these were large firms rather than individuals. Then 849 retail outlets went to all these firms. There were other proposals which were not agreed to, which were not executed, like opening shops till 3 a.m. which happens in Haryana, then lowering the drinking age to 21, then home delivery of liquors. So not all the part of this excise policy was executed. But the issue was that multiple agencies, multiple investigative agencies, as well as liquor companies, they found out that between the old and the new regime, the margin of these firms, these retail firms, that has increased by more than 100%. Now, what else? What was the controversy all about? So first was hefty discounts. So 1+1 scheme was going on. That means you take one bottle and one bottle was given by these large firms to build, let's say, customers. Then foreign liquor and foreign beer, which is imported into India, it became cheaper due to waiving off rupees 50 on each of these imports, which were earlier in the old regime. Then the number of dry days, the idea was to reduce the number of dry days from 21 to 3. But this was categorically rejected by the Lieutenant Governor. Then the extension of license, and this happened during COVID, that without charging of any extra fee, the license was renewed and was given some extra time. Then there were waivers also. So waiver on the pretext of COVID of amounting to rupees 144 crores. So all these were the controversial points, the allegations of round tipping, the allegations of kickbacks, and the various provisions were now nailed by the Enforcement Directorate. The Enforcement Directorate here feels that the funds which were taken from these large firms, it went to funding of elections in the Goa local elections. Then the ED says that the said political party was the recipient of the proceeds. So number of people have gone on to being arrested by the Enforcement Directorate on charges of corruption, on charges of embezzlement of funds, on charges of money laundering. But who is the final recipient? Who is the beneficiary? So in this particular case, Enforcement Directorate feels that the recipient is none other than a political party. So the question then arises, can a political party be kept as accused in the PMLA? So the political commentary said apart, the law says that the PMLA provisions can be against an individual, it can be against a group of individuals. Then the Representation of People's Act also calls a political party as a group of individuals. So now it would be seen that whether or not the Supreme Court allows or the court allows the ED to finally keep the political party as accused. Why? Because the whole case on the Delhi excise policy rests on the single argument that all the final beneficiary, all the money that was accruing from the embezzlement in the said excise policy was going to a political party. So the court asked, if the political party is not one of the accused, how will the case self-sustain itself? And therefore, now the ED is thinking about making the political party as an accused. Now we must appreciate that any trust, any NGO or any trustee of a trust can be kept as accused, can be an accused in a PMLA case. And therefore, this will also be the first instance where a political party can be kept as accused. Now, it is also important that a political party is not considered a company under the Companies Act of 2013. So this complex conundrum will be yet to be seen before the court of whether or not the court will allow a political party to be kept as accused for PMLA Act. Let's look at the third article, that Himalayas need a EIA, and this is in the backdrop of the Tista Dam breach. This is in the backdrop of the cascading disaster that we saw in Sikkim, and also the incessant rainfall that we saw in the Himachal Pradesh region and the Himalayan ecosystem in general, which led to a lot of landslides and created havoc in tourist destinations like Manali. Now, this pertains to your GS1, GS3, where we are looking at disaster management as well as environment. Then, what is the basis of EAI? So, whenever we are talking about environmental impact assessment, we are essentially using a developmental tool where we need to balance three elements. The first element is people. Then, we have to look at the profits. That is, how a company is going to develop and whether or not it is able to accrue some profit. People, that means any social aspect must be kept in check. Development should not violate the rights of the people. And most importantly, the idea of planet or the idea of environment. So all this is essentially part of the sustainable development that we saw from the Brundtland Commission. Now, UNEP says that this is a developmental tool. And where do we use such a developmental tool? So, whenever we are going for some massive projects, whenever we are going for dams, whenever we are going for, let's say, diversion of some river streams, or we are going for canal creation, or we are going for large infrastructure projects. A very good example is the Three Gorges Dam in China. So, if we are taking such large scale projects which can have impacts on the flow system, natural flow system, on the lives of people. So in the name of development, we cannot go for such mega projects. So specifically, the EIA came from such large projects like dams, nuclear power plants, then going for large thermal power plants. Now, over the period of time, we must also appreciate that whenever we look at a project, there are some issues which can raise red flags. So what we can do is we can go for some modification. Then there are some impacts which cannot be avoided. Let's say we are looking at national security related infrastructure. So we must go for some mitigation measures. So EIA looks into all those perspectives, and it is essentially to aid a development without violating the environment and without violating the society. Now, what is the need? The need is very simple, that development is the way forward. But simultaneously, we cannot affect the sustainability of the ecosystem and we cannot take away the resources of the future. That is the idea of sustainable development. Now, whenever we are looking at the EIA, so we have various layers. So first layer is screening and scoping, where we are actually looking at a project and we are understanding whether or not this project is environmentally viable, whether or not it is environmentally sustainable or not. If it violates too much of the environmental sustainability, naturally it will have to go through the other scopes, through the other layers of EIA tool. If it is not violating, if it is within the carrying capacity, then there is a go ahead. That means there is a environmental clearance or EC. Then if there is high scope of there is high impact in terms of development, then we go for assessment of the environmental risk. Then if there is environmental risk, then we go for mitigation measures, how to decrease the impact. And finally, the decision to go ahead with the project or to stop the project or to go for part of the project. And lastly, to monitor whether all the tools, whether all the decisions that we took during the project is being executed or not. And all of this is simultaneously done with the engagement of all the stakeholders, including the people living in these regions. Now, whenever we look historically in terms of EIA evolution, we are looking at the river valley projects of India. At that point of time, EIA was not a term yet coined. So we were just looking at the sustainability of large river projects. Then EIA took shape under the NEPA Act in US, where it was made compulsory for large projects. Then we went for the EIA notification in 1994 under the Environmental Protection Act of 1986, where we started the legal route for going for EIA. But the final shape we took in EIA notification of 2006. Now this is also under the Environmental Protection Act of 1986. Here we categorized various projects into national projects and state projects. Then there was some mandatory EIA for large projects, for example, for thermal power plant, for mining projects. Then we also went for decentralization. For minor projects or smaller level projects, the state was also given the authority, the state government were also given the authority to go for EIA scoping. And after this, we went for the draft EIA, which is yet to take shape of 2020. Here some contentious provisions were laid down. Why? Because the 2006 regulation, the 2006 notification, the issue was that industrialists were feeling that there is no certainty of environmental regulation, and the moment they go for large or massive projects, suddenly EIA comes in their backdrop, and it can affect the financial viability of not only these projects but also the companies, because these are billion-dollar projects. So in the draft EIA, ex post facto clearance was sought. That means, let's say I have gone to develop a port and let's say I have not done EIA. So after the creation of project, I am going for EIA. Then there was a reduced time for hearing in terms of public hearing in EIA. Then going for exemption to certain projects, let's say projects which are related to national security. Now, why do we need a Himalayan EIA? So the author argues that apart from all the regions that we have in India, and we have to go for a Himalayan region EIA, because Himalayan origins, it is very different from all other parts of India. Himalayas being a fragile region, it is made up of sedimentary rocks and it is part of the active plate boundaries. If any tremor happens, so it can trigger multiple hazards and multiple cascading disasters, just the way we saw when we can connect the Nepal quakes with the cascading disaster that happened in Sikkim. So we must look at the fragile ecosystem, which is also a seismic zone. It is made up of sedimentary rocks and it is landslide prone. It is prone to, it is also the water tower. That means we are also looking at the source of some of the large river systems of India. And it is also the place where we have majority of our glaciers of India. So it is the water tower of not only India but also the South Asian region. Then this region being fragile will have low carrying capacity, and simultaneously we are looking at mass tourism in these regions. And therefore, given that the region is different from other regions of India and also becomes a region for the and becomes a critical issue for not only India but also for the region, and therefore there must be some heightened level of EIA which is based upon some dynamic data inputs and resilient building regulations which are suitable to the Himalayan ecology. Let's look at constitutional bench, and this pertains to your GS2 Indian Constitution. Now, a constitutional bench can be constituted by the Chief Justice of India, and it is an ad hoc bench. That means it's not a permanent bench. The constitutional bench is not sitting all the time, and the judges, therefore, in the constitutional bench will be decided by the Chief Justice of India, and therefore the constitutional bench will be set up whenever there is a recommendation by the CJI that a particular case will be referred to the constitutional bench. Now, why a case will be referred to the constitutional bench? When there is some substantial question of law or there is conflicting judgments at the level of multiple high courts, or there is conflicting judgment when it comes to different Supreme Court judgments, let's say different division benches of the Supreme Court have given different opinion on the same matter, then it can be referred by the CJI to a constitutional bench. And a good example of the constitutional bench is the Keshavanand Bharti case. It can also be the Aadhaar judgment. It can also be the Puttuswamy judgment, the privacy judgment. Now, also, whenever the president seeks opinion of the Chief Justice of India of the Supreme Court on some legal matter, even though the opinion might not be completely taken up or executed by the president, however, even if there is a opinion which is sought from the Supreme Court, from the higher judiciary, then the constitutional bench will sit, and it is about at least 5 judges. That is what is referred under Article 145(3). That means a constitutional bench will always have 5 judges. And that is one of the issues whenever there is criticism on some substantial cases, that many a times substantial question of law has been adjudicated by smaller benches. And this also points out to the lack of judges, or the pendency of cases, or the lack of time of the higher judiciary to dwell on to issues which are substantial in terms of law. Let's look at the Arab League, and this pertains to GS2 international relations. Now, the Arab League is a regional Arab organization which pertains to the Middle East and the Africa, more particularly the North Africa region, which is adjacent to the Mediterranean Sea. And its formation was in 1945 with founding members like Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And its headquarters is in Cairo, which is in Egypt. Then today we have 22 members, and that is why this Arab League is in news because of the Israel-Palestine conflict, where the Arab League has asked Israel to de-escalate as well as Hamas to de-escalate and not to make this a regional conflict. Then Syria's participation has been suspended due to the civil war. Then there is a council which is the highest decision-making body of the league and usually consists of the foreign ministers. Then the decisions is based upon a majority basis. Now we must also appreciate that informally the king of the Middle East will be Saudi Arabia, and similarly the dictum of Saudi Arabia is also valid on the Arab League. Then each member has only one vote, but the dictum will always lie with the dominant party, which is Saudi Arabia and its allies. Thank you so much. I hope it helped.